Hi, this is Sarah Anderson with Victoria Hayden and Madeline Strong, and we are going to go over Module 1B, an overview of the U.S. policymaking and public policy process. These are the objectives. You guys can feel free to read those on your own, and we'll go over all of these throughout the presentation. Okay, so what is public policy? So public policy, according to Birkeland in his book, An Introduction to the Policy Process, there's no one way to define public policy. Rather, it's easiest to define it by understanding its key characteristics, which are that policy is a response to some problem that's requiring our attention. Policy is made on behalf of the public. It is oriented towards a specific goal or desired state. Ultimately, it is made by the government despite influences from external participants. Interpretation and implementation of policy is carried out by both public and private actors with their own ideas and interpretations of the problem and solutions at hand and their own motivators. And policy is both what the government chooses to do and what it chooses not to do. So many scholars and political theorists have provided their own definitions of public policy, and this definition on the right-hand side of the screen is a pretty succinct explanation of public policy given by B. Guy Peters in saying that public policy is the sum of government activities, whether acting directly or through agents, as it has an influence on the life of its citizens. So politics goes hand in hand with public policy. So what are politics? Birkeland defines politics as a process by which societies help figure out how to organize and regulate themselves. So politics, or how people decide to govern themselves, directly affects how policy is made. Politics occur in the public sphere, and decisions are made by the public that address issues that affect people throughout the community. Both politics and public policy involve making decisions on behalf of the population that directly impact our lives. So as an applied science, public policy is about solving problems. Public policy as a science is dedicated to understanding how issues become a part of the government's agenda, how alternatives are generated for officials to choose from, and why certain issues don't make it to the forefront of the government's agenda. Theorists in public policy strive to develop theories not only about how these problems are identified, but also how policy is generated to address them. For many scholars, the interest and importance of public policy science lies in one's ability to utilize it to apply tools from other disciplines to social problems, resulting in a greater understanding of society and politics as a whole. In the process of studying and understanding policy, theorists, political scientists, and even you and I can potentially contribute to policymaking and create change. And while the science of public policy is a relatively new area of research, policymaking has an extensive history in the United States, dating back to our early days as a country. So, as far as the history of U.S. policymaking, according to Birkeland, the history of policymaking in the United States has been characterized by both remarkable stability and remarkable change. The Constitution, which was ratified in 1790, established our governmental structure and established how and where policies could be made through the basic features of our constitutional order. Two key components are the idea of federalism, which deals with the separation of jurisdictions between state and federal governments, and the separation of powers among three branches of government. The result is a political system that promotes restraint in public policy creation and requires that the government carefully consider advantages and disadvantages of a new policy before it can be instituted. This results in the United States' characteristically slow but deliberate process of policy change. While some changes have been made to improve the Constitution as our worldview has shifted, these basic principles still exist and impact how policy is made today. So next, we'll watch a brief video with more historical context on the policymaking process in the United States.
So what is federalism? Most simply, it's the idea that in the US, governmental power is divided between the government of the United States and the government of the individual states. The government of the US, the national government, is sometimes called the federal government, while the state governments are just called the state governments. This is because
Sarah, I think that video stopped with the sound.
System, the national government takes care of some things,
How's
like,
it
for
now?
example, war with other countries and delivering the mail, while the state government takes care of other things like driver's license, hunter's license, barber's license, dentist license, license to kill. That's James Bond, and that's in England, and that I hope states don't do that. Pretty simple, right? Maybe not. For one thing, there are some aspects of government that are handled by both the state and the national government. Taxes, Americans' favorite government activity, are an example. There are federal taxes and state taxes. But it gets even more complicated because there are different types of federalism depending on what period in American history you're talking about. Stan, why is history so confusing? Stan, you can tell me? Can you talk, Stan? Basically, though, there are two main types of federalism. Dual federalism, which has nothing to do with Aaron Burr, usually refers to the period of American history that stretches from the founding of our great nation until the New Deal. And cooperative federalism, which has been the rule since the 1930s. Let's start with an easy one and look at dual federalism in the thought bubble. From 1788 until 1937, the U.S. basically lived under a regime of dual federalism, which meant government power was strictly divided between the state and national governments. Notice I didn't say separated because I don't want you to confuse federalism with separation of powers. Don't do it! With dual federalism, there are some things that only the federal government does and some things that only the state governments do. This is sometimes called jurisdiction. The national government had jurisdiction over internal improvements like interstate roads and canals, subsidies to the states, and tariffs, which are taxes on imports and thus fall under the general heading of foreign policy. The national government also owns public lands and regulates patents, which need to be national for them to offer protection for inventors in all the states. And because you want a silver dollar in Delaware to be worth the same as a silver dollar in Georgia, the national government also controls currency. The state government had control over property laws, inheritance laws, commercial laws, banking laws, corporate laws, insurance, family law, which means marriage and divorce, morality, stuff like public lewdness and drinking, keeps me in check, public health, education, criminal laws, including determining what is a crime and how crimes are prosecuted, land use, which includes water and mineral rights, elections, local government, and licensing of professions and occupations. Basically, what's required to drive a car, or open a bar, or become a barber, or become James Bond. So, under dual federalism, the state government has jurisdiction over a lot more than the national government. These powers over health, safety, and morality are sometimes called police power, and usually belong to the states. Because of the strict division between the two types of government, dual federalism is sometimes called layer cake federalism. Delicious. And it's consistent with the tradition of limited government that many Americans hold very dear. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Now, some of you might be wondering, Craig, where does the national government get the power to do anything that has to do with states? Yeah, well, off the top of my head, the U.S. Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. This is what's known as the Commerce Clause, and the way that it's been interpreted forms the basis of dual federalism and cooperative federalism. For most of the 19th century, the Supreme Court decided that almost any attempt by any government, federal or state, to regulate state economic activity would violate the Commerce Clause. This basically meant that there was very little regulation of business at all. Freedom! And this is how things stood, with the U.S. following a system of dual federalism with very little government regulation, and the national government not doing much other than going to war, buying or conquering enormous amounts of territory, and delivering the mail. Then the Great Depression happened, and Franklin Roosevelt and Congress enacted the New Deal, which changed the role of the federal government in a big way. The New Deal brought us cooperative federalism, where the national government encourages states and localities to pursue nationally defined goals. The main way that the federal government does this is through dollar bills, y'all. Money is what I'm saying. Stan, can I make it rain? Yeah? All right, I'm doing it. I happen to have cash in my hand right now. Oh yeah, take my federal money, states. Regulate me a regulator. This money that the federal government gives to the state is called a grant and aid. Grants and aid can work like a carrot, encouraging a state to adopt a certain policy, or work like a stick when the federal government withholds funds if a state doesn't do what the national government wants. Grants and aid are usually called categorical because they're given to states for a particular purpose like transportation or education or alleviating poverty. There are two types of categorical grants and aid: formula grants and project grants. Under a formula grant, a state gets aid in a certain amount of money based on a mathematical formula. The best example of this is the old way welfare was given in the U.S. under the program called Aid to Families with Dependent Children. AFDC. States got a certain amount of money for every person who is classified as poor. The more poor people a state had, the more money it got. Project grants require states to submit proposals in order to receive aid. The states compete for a limited pool of resources. Nowadays, project grants are more common than formula grants, but neither is as popular as block grants, which the government gives out Lego blocks and then you build stuff with the Legos. It's a good time. No, where the national government gives a state a huge chunk of money for something big like infrastructure, which is made with concrete and steel, not Legos, and the state is allowed to figure out how to spend the money. The basic type of cooperative federalism is the carrot stick type, which is sometimes called marble cake federalism because it mixes up the state and federal governments in ways that makes it impossible to separate the two. Federalism, it's such a culinary delight. The key to this is, you guessed it, dollar bills, y'all, money. But there's another aspect of cooperative federalism that's really not so cooperative, and that's regulated federalism. Under regulated federalism, the national government sets up regulations and rules that the states must follow. Some examples of these rules, also called mandates, are EPA regulations, civil rights standards, and the rules set up by the Americans with Disabilities Act. Sometimes the government gives the states money to implement the rules, but sometimes it doesn't, and they must comply anyway. That's called an unfunded mandate, or as I like to call it, an unfun mandate, because no money, no fun. A good example of this is OSHA regulations that employers have to follow. States don't like these, and Congress tried to do something about them with the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, or UMRA, but it hasn't really worked. In the early 21st century, Americans are basically living under a system of cooperative federalism with some areas of activity that are heavily regulated. This is a stretch from the original idea that federalism will keep the national government small and have most government functions belong to the states. If you follow American politics, and I know you do, this small government ideal should sound familiar because it's the bedrock principle of many conservatives and libertarians in the US. As conservatives made major political inroads after the 1970s, a new concept of federalism, which was actually kind of an old concept of federalism, became popular. It was called, surprise, New Federalism, and it was popularized by Presidents Nixon and Reagan. Just to be clear, it's called New Federalism, not surprise, New Federalism. New federalism basically means giving more power to the states, and this has been done in three ways. First, block grants allow states discretion to decide what to do with federal money. And what's a better way to express your power than spending money? Or not spending money, as the case may be. Another form of new federalism is devolution, which is the process of giving state and local governments the power to enforce regulations, devolving power from the national to the state level. Finally, some courts have picked up the cause of new federalism through cases based on the 10th Amendment, which states, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." The idea that some powers, like those police powers I talked about before, are reserved by the states has been used to put something of a brake on the Commerce Clause. So as you can see, where we are with federalism today is kind of complicated. Presidents Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Clinton seem to favor new federalism and block grants. But George W. Bush seemed to push back towards regulated federalism with laws like No Child Left Behind and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. It's pretty safe to say that we're going to continue to live under a regime of cooperative federalism with a healthy dose of regulation thrown in. But many Americans feel that the national government is too big and expensive and not what the framers wanted. If history is any guide, a system of dual federalism with most of the government in the hands of the states is probably not going to happen. For some reason, it's really difficult to convince institutions to give up powers once they've got them. I'm never giving up this power. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course Government.
All right, so as we saw in the video, now you kind of have an understanding of the history of public policy and the history of who has the power to make what types of decisions on policy. So now we can discuss another characteristic defined in the Constitution that affects our policymaking historically, which is the key concept of the separation of powers through the three branches of government. The separation of powers profoundly impacts the policymaking process and institutes boundaries to prevent hasty, radical, or widely unsupported policy change. So the three different branches are the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. In the context of policymaking, in general, the executive and legislative branches, which are often considered the political branches, are the ones creating the policy, and the judicial branch is tasked with ensuring that the policies are implemented justly. So next we'll have another little video about each of the branches and their responsibilities.
Have you ever wondered who has the authority to make laws or punish people who break them? When we think of power in the United States, we usually think of the president, but he does not act alone. In fact, he is only one piece of the power puzzle, and for very good reason. When the American Revolution ended in 1783, the United States government was in a state of change. The founding fathers knew that they did not want to establish another country that was ruled by a king. So the discussions were centered on having a strong and fair national government that protected individual freedoms and did not abuse its power. When the new Constitution was adopted in 1787, the structure of the infant government of the United States called for three separate branches, each with their own powers, and a system of checks and balances. This would ensure that no one branch would ever become too powerful because the other branches would always be able to check the power of the other two. These branches worked together to run the country and set guidelines for us all to live by. The legislative branch is described in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Many people feel that the founding fathers put this branch in the document first because they thought it was the most important. The legislative branch is comprised of 100 U.S. senators and 435 members in the U.S. House of Representatives. This is better known as a U.S. Congress. Making laws is a primary function of the legislative branch, but it is also responsible for approving federal judges and justices, passing the national budget, and declaring war. Each state gets 2 senators and some number of representatives, depending on how many people live in that state. The executive branch is described in Article 2 of the Constitution. The leaders of this branch of government are the president and vice president, who are responsible for enforcing the laws that Congress sets forth. The president works closely with a group of advisors known as the cabinet. These appointed helpers assist the president in making important decisions within their area of expertise, such as defense, the Treasury, and Homeland Security. The executive branch also appoints government officials, commands the armed forces, and meets with leaders of other nations. All that combined is a lot of work for a lot of people. In fact, the executive branch employs over 4 million people to get everything done. The third branch of the U.S. government is the judicial branch and is detailed in Article 3. This branch is comprised of all the courts in the land, from the federal district courts to the U.S. Supreme Court. These courts interpret our nation's laws and punish those who break them. The highest court, the Supreme Court, settles disputes among states, hears appeals from state and federal courts, and determines if federal laws are constitutional. There are 9 justices on the Supreme Court, and unlike any other job in our government, Supreme Court justices are appointed for life, or for as long as they want to stay. Our democracy depends on an informed citizenry, so it is our duty to know how it works and what authority each branch of government has over its citizens. Besides voting, chances are that sometime in your life, you'll be called upon to participate in your government, whether it is to serve on a jury, testify in court, or petition your congressperson to pass or defeat an idea for a law. By knowing the branches, who runs them, and how they work together, you can be involved, informed, and intelligent.
All right. So in today's world, how does the government decide what issues need to be addressed through policy? So the agenda refers to the most important big picture issues that the government considers priority, that they decide are the ones that they want to address first. So one example could be the rising cost of medical care. Once an agenda is determined, alternatives, often in the form of policy changes, are proposed to address the issue at hand. So in the cost of medical care example, some alternatives could be direct government regulation of healthcare costs, nationalizing the healthcare system with a socialized medicine model, offer increased coverage for individuals, or sometimes the alternative is to do nothing. So as we saw in the last video, the branches of government all work in relation with each other to enact change. The same is true of agenda setting and alternative generation. Each branch has their own ability to both define the agenda and come up with alternatives. In general, the president and other members of the administration, such as appointees in departments and bureaus, play the greatest role in deciding the agenda and deciding the issue that is most salient. They have less control over the alternatives that are considered. Congress is central to the agenda and the alternatives. Staffers have more impact on the alternatives, whereas congressional members have more impact on the agenda. The judicial branch is key to implementation of these alternatives and ensuring they are implemented justly. So the role of each branch in the creation of public policy and in the creation of agendas and alternatives is very apparent in the videos that we just watched and in this slide, but also you can tell their role by looking at the process by which a bill becomes a law, which we will discuss next.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics. And today I've got my work cut out for me because I'm going to try to do something that every single social studies teacher in the US has tried to do, even though there's a perfectly good cartoon you could just show. It's from the 70s. It's catchy. It's fun. That's right. Today we're going to learn how a bill becomes a law, but we're not going to be able to license the Schoolhouse Rock song. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a... You know what has a bill? An eagle.
The sound must have been that.
Okay, I think the only way we're going to possibly be able to compete with Schoolhouse Rock is to jump right into the thought bubble with our own cartoon and to stop talking about Schoolhouse Rock. So let's start at the very beginning, which in this case is a congressman or a senator introducing a bill. The real beginning is when he or she has an idea for a law, and even this might come from an interest group, the executive branch, or even the constituents. But the formal process begins with the legislator introducing the bill. After its introduction, the bill is referred to a committee. Although most bills can start in either house, except for revenue bills, which must start in the House, let's imagine that our bill starts in the Senate because it's easier. Congress has the power to make rules concerning the armed forces, so let's say this is a bill about naming helicopters. Anywho, this bill would be referred to the Senate Armed Services Committee, which would then write up the bill in formal legal language, or markup, and vote on it. If the markup wins a majority in the committee, it moves to the floor of the full Senate for consideration. The Senate decides the rules for debate, how long the debate will go on, and whether or not there will be amendments. An open rule allows for amendments, and a closed rule does not. Open rules make it much less likely for bills to pass because opponents of the bill can add clauses that will make it hard for the bill's proponents to vote for. If opponents of our helicopter name bill were to add a clause repealing the Affordable Care Act or something, some supporters of the bill probably wouldn't vote for it. If a bill wins the majority of votes in the Senate, it moves on to the House. Thanks, Thought Bubble. We're going to have to go the rest of the way without fancy animation. But I could sing it. I'm not going to sing it. I'm not going to use a funny voice. The Senate version of the bill is sent to the House. The House has an extra step in that all bills, before they go out to the floor of the House, must go to the Rules Committee, which reports it out to the House. If a bill receives the majority of votes in the House, 238 or more to be exact, it passes. Yay! Now, this is important. The exact same bill has to pass both houses before it can go to the president. This almost never happens, though. Usually, the second house to get the bill will want to make some changes to it, and if this happens, it will go to a conference committee, which is made up of members of both houses. The conference committee attempts to reconcile both versions of the bill and come up with a new version, sometimes called a compromise bill. Okay, so if the conference committee reaches a compromise, it then sends the bill back to both houses for a new vote. If it passes, then it's sent to the president. And then the president signs the bill, boom, done. That's the only option. Oh, no, there's two other options. Option 2 is for him to veto the bill, and we've gone through all of this for nothing. The third option is only available at the end of a congressional term. If the president neither signs nor vetoes a bill, and then in the next 10 days Congress goes out of session, the bill does not become a law. This is called a pocket veto, and is only used when the president doesn't want a law to pass, but for political reasons doesn't want to veto it either. Congress can avoid this altogether by passing bills and giving them to the president before that 10-day period. If the president neither signs nor vetoes a law, and Congress remains in session for more than 10 days, the bill becomes a law without the president's signature. So that's the basic process, but there is one wrinkle, or if you want to be all Madisonian about it, check on the president's power. If Congress really wanted a bill and the president has vetoed it, they can override the veto if it gets a 2/3 majority in both houses on a second vote. Then the bill becomes a law over the president's signature. Oh, snap! This is really rare, but it does happen once in a great while. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1953 passed over Truman's veto. I like to call it the Tartley Act. Shorten it. It's a portmanteau. It doesn't happen that often because if the president knows that 2/3 of the congressmen supported the bill, he won't veto it. And if Congress knows that they don't have 2/3 support, they won't try to override the veto. Nobody wants to try something and fail in public, right? Except for me, obviously, if you look at my other YouTube channel, Wheezy Waiter. So there you have it, how a bill becomes a law. I'll admit the process is a little cumbersome, but it's designed that way so that we don't get a lot of stupid or dangerous laws. Still, this doesn't quite explain why so few laws get passed. Bills have a very high mortality rate, and it's way more common for a bill not to become a law than to become one. The main reason is that there are so many places where a bill can die. The first place that a bill can die is at the murderous hands of the speaker or majority leader who refuses to refer it to committee. Then the committee can kill the bill by not voting for it at all. And if they do vote and it doesn't get a majority, then the bill doesn't go to the floor, and it's dead. In the Senate, the murderous leadership can kill a bill by refusing to schedule a vote on it, and any senator can filibuster the bill, which is when he or she threatens to keep debating until the bill is tabled. It's a bit more complex than that, but the filibuster rules have changed recently, so hopefully we won't have as many filibuster threats in the future. The House doesn't have a filibuster, but it does have a rules committee that can kill a bill by not creating a rule for debate. The entire House can also vote to recommit the bill to committee, which is a signal to drop the bill or change it significantly. And of course, if either house fails to give a bill a majority of votes, then it dies. This applies to compromise bills coming out of conference committees too. Even if a bill gets a majority of both houses, then there's that whole veto thing that the president can do. Remember? So there are many more ways for a bill to be killed than to become a law. These hurdles are sometimes called veto gates. They can't call them Bill Gates because that's a person. The veto gates make it very difficult for Congress to act unless there is broad agreement or the issue is uncontroversial, like naming a post office or thanking specific groups of veterans for their service, which are two things that Congress actually does pretty efficiently. I mean, think of all the post offices that aren't named. You can't think of one, can you? Name it. You can't. It's that name. Veto gates are purely procedural, which means they don't draw a lot of attention from the media. The easiest way for Congress to kill bills is to simply not vote on them, or even schedule votes for them. This way they don't have to go on record as being for or against a bill, just whether they support having a vote. And constituents rarely check up on this sort of thing. So I hope I managed to do a good job of both explaining how a bill becomes a law and why it's difficult for most bills to pass. And I hope I looked good doing it as well. This might be frustrating, but it's strangely comforting to consider that Congress and the government as a whole were designed to make it difficult to get things done. A single super powerful executive like a king can be very efficient, but also tyrannical. We don't like tyrannical around here. The founders set up these structural hurdles of the bicameral Congress and the presidential role in legislation to reduce the likelihood that authoritarian laws would pass. Congress added procedural hurdles like committees and filibusters for the same reason. You can argue that Congress has become dysfunctional, but looking at the process of lawmaking, it's hard to argue that this isn't by design. So next time someone accuses you of being difficult, you just say, I was behaving in a senatorial manner.
So the next thing that we're going to talk about is the policymaking process. The policy process is pretty much explained in many different ways, but it typically involves problem identification, agenda setting, alternative specification, decision-making, and then implementation and evaluation. More specifically, we're going to talk about Kingdon's process stream. Kingdon explains the policymaking process is not so linear, but the analogy of multiple independent flowing streams that eventually come together as one, and we'll go more in depth about that. So according to Kingdon, we conceive of three process streams flowing through the system streams of problems, policies, and politics. They are largely independent of one another, and each develops according to its own dynamics and roles. But at some critical junctures, the three streams are joined, and the greatest policy changes grow out of that coupling of problems, policy proposals, and politics. The first stream that we're going to talk about is Kingdon's problem stream. It considers how problems come to be recognized and how conditions come to be defined as problems. Problems are brought to the attention of people in and around the government by systematic indicators, by focusing events like crises or disasters, or by feedback from the operation of current programs. People define conditions as problems by comparing current conditions with their values concerning more ideal states of affairs, by comparing their own performance with that of other countries, or by putting the subject into one category rather than another. Okay. Next slide. The next stream we're going to talk about is the policy stream. This stream resembles a process of biological natural selection. Many ideas are possible in principle and float around in a policy primeval soup, is what Kingdon explains it as. He says this is in which specialists try out their ideas in a variety of ways: bill introductions, speeches, testimonies, papers, and conversation. In that consideration, proposals are floated, come into contact with one another, and are revised and combined with one another and floated again. But the proposals that survive the status of serious consideration meet several criteria, including their technical feasibility, their fit with dominant values and their current national mood, their budgetary workability, and the political support or opposition they might experience. Thus, the selection system narrows the set of conceivable proposals and selects from that large set a short list of proposals that actually are available for serious consideration. The last stream is the politics stream, and it is composed of factors such as swings of national mood, administration or legislation turnover, and interest group pressure campaigns. The political agenda items that are congruent with the current national mood, that enjoy interest group support or lack organized opposition, and that fit the orientations of prevailing legislative coalitions or current administrations, are more likely to rise to the agenda prominence than items that do not meet such conditions. In particular, turnover of key participants, such as change of administration, has powerful effects on the policy agendas. The combination of perceived national mood and turnover of elected officials particularly affects the agendas, while the balance of organized forces is more likely to affect the alternatives considered. So like mentioned earlier, all three streams end up going into the essential policy window. Really, the policy, this is when they all must couple for there to be the opportunistic time for the bill to actually progress on. So the policy and politics streams must couple. This happens when there is an open window. There are driving forces like national mood, organizational interest, election repercussion, and orientation of elected politicians to which open the window and lead to restructuring of the decision agenda. But and that's what I had said earlier. So it requires the joining of all three of the streams. Again, they have to couple together to become concrete. Sorry, my dog's bothering me. And then each stream must align with one another to fit the open window. If one of those streams is absent, it will be difficult to elevate an issue to the government's agenda. And then another thing talked about during this like policy window, open window time is a policy entrepreneur. This is just someone that in government who takes a particular interest in the problem identified and really champions for this policy amongst their peers in government. They're willing to invest their own time in this policy and fight for it to move it more onto the government's agenda. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is health policy issues and concerns that are current in today. So on the state level, there's been a lot of talk about medical cannabis. I found some related bills. So House Bill 521 and Senate Bill 186. Pretty much those proposed bills would allow more lenience on marijuana possession within the state. And so that's kind of that right now. I think they're still just sitting in committee or something like that. So there's not been much push for it because this was all taken from last year's data. And then I do know, just hearing in talks and clinical and things like that, a new bill that has just been signed by the governor has passed that allows medical providers to provide a note to individuals basically stating that they're using marijuana for medical purposes. And then if they're caught with like a certain amount, and I don't quite know what that particular amount is, this letter that they would have will allow them to be in possession of it for medical purposes. So that's kind of leading on to the medical cannabis, Kentucky's issue that we're dealing with. Another thing is the opioid epidemic. The House Bill 427 relates to that. Lawmakers are debating on how to spend the money currently from a new opioid settlement from the major pharmaceutical companies. So that's kind of been talked about in government more recently. House Bill 427 was signed into a law that established the Kentucky Opioid Abatement Advisory Commission and also the trust fund that was signed back in last year. And then another thing I just thought it would be nice to mention, because this is a health issue and it's directly kind of related to us, is we are discussing eliminating collaborative agreements for Kentucky nurse practitioners. As you know, we are a partial state, meaning that we do have to have a collaborative agreement with an MD in order to prescribe. So in one of the modules, I believe it was the immersion module activities, there was a letter posted from Dr. Osage and Dr. Melander. It was their op-ed. And I actually was discussing how, over through COVID, we basically lifted all of these agreements under the emergency thing that they had. And where their op-ed was calling for these to be permanently lifted because we saw how much it increased healthcare access for Kentuckians by allowing the Kentucky APRNs to provide care for them. And again, you can find that link under the activities for Immersion Week module. As far as health policy issues and concerns for the national level, I found a few of these just off of, it was Becker's website, I believe, but some of the top ones that I'm going to discuss, and these again were for the year of 2021. So this was like the outlook for 2022. They still kind of fit with 2023 since we're just in the very beginning of the year. It's hard to identify exactly the issues we're going to be dealing with this year. So COVID, definitely, obviously, that has been something that we've been dealing with. It's going to continue to drive policy changes and decisionations from vaccination mandates to access to testing. Telehealth is another thing. So early in the pandemic, Congress granted flexibilities to allow providers to deliver services to Medicare beneficiaries via telehealth. So hopefully the flexibilities will be extended by legislators. Drug pricing, along with reforms proposed in the Build Back Better bill. So last year, the 340B program, which allowed limited access to lower cost prescription drugs, was also considered. They also talked about the surprise billing. So the No Surprises Act, which was enacted in December of 2020, it took effect last year in January at this time. And you might notice that you have to sign these papers now when you go to your doctor. It's just basically that we won't do any surprise billing that you're unaware of. And then the mental health policy, the high level of stress the pandemic puts on the frontline workers, including healthcare professionals, is being recognized. So in July of 2022, so last year, a new suicide hotline was set up, and lawmakers were working on passing the Lorna Breen Healthcare Provider Protection Act, which is named after a physician who died by suicide. Next. And then, so where do us as nurses and advanced practice providers come in to shape policy? Nurse practitioners actually have a really essential role in policy making. We have the clinical expertise and the background. We are on the front lines. We can conduct QI in our various clinics and disseminate those findings. We can help write bills, share our personal stories, which include like talking points and the economic impact and reduction or reallocation of economic resources. And we can also be a part of organizations that will lobby on behalf of patients. As far as another thing that we can do is we can conduct research to advance and inform health policy. This is all taken from, again, one of the papers that was listed in the activities module for Mersin, but health policy research informs, characterizes, explains, and tests hypotheses by employing a variety of research designs, and it can focus on improving the access to care, quality of care, and efficiency. More frequently, this paper reported that health policies are not really conducted by nurses. And we have just some of the top things. We are top in poor healthcare ranking. I think we're like 11th. And then 7 out of 10 deaths are from preventable disease. We have multiple uninsured people. There's a primary care shortage. There's health disparities. So although these problems are well known, we do need more research to enhance understanding of them. And then ultimately, the goal of policy research is to address the health problems that occur in our society, to improve access to healthcare, improve quality of care, and the efficiency. So nurses can definitely help with that.
I'm going to talk about the video that we watched that kind of showed the process of a Kentucky bill being passed. I just want to share a quick little story. So I actually have like a personal experience with bill making and passing through the House and Senate, and I actually participated in something called KYA and CUNA. So in Kentucky and a few states around the country, there's the opportunity for middle school and high school students to go to the capitals in their particular states and participate in these things where we wrote bills and then we had to pass them in the state or in the House and the Senate. And then they actually do go to the governor to see, which is kind of interesting. So I wrote numerous bills over the years, but one bill in particular, I passed through both the House and the Senate, and I got to be a part of one of these committees. So watching this video was interesting because I've sat in those seats, and although it was obviously on a much smaller scale, I resonated with that, and it was interesting and kind of like nostalgic to look back on.
I did KYA too, so
Oh, you
my
did?
girl never made it that far, but yeah,
Oh, cool.
yeah. So I
Yeah.
felt the same way watching it.
Yeah, it was fun. My bill was on it was in high school students having access to a self-defense class as part of one of their PE classes. So that was something I was just like passionate about as a woman. And now, like before this class, I honestly didn't even think about nurses' role in government and health policy. Like the only example I had was Mayor Linda Gordon. That's the only thing that I thought of when I thought of people and nurses in government. But regardless, back to the video. So it asked, some of the questions and talking points were, what methods did the advocates of the bills use to get their message to key legislature? So people discussed like research that was evidence-based behind. There were open debates that occurred in different parts of the video. And then behind the scenes maneuvering, this is something that even was present, Sarah, you probably saw in KY and Kuna, like there were lobbyists handing out little like cards with their information and things. And that also happened in the video. And then we got to see a really good like intimate moment with the task force and the governor, where he was kind of like off on his own little world for a minute, but then it came back and it showed the task force like really fighting to put together all of the research and the information that they had to then present to the committee later. And then we saw intimate committees and personal letters that had lobbyists where they shared their experience, like with mental health or with early childhood care, and why that was so important.
That's awesome that you have such a personal story with us.
Yeah, I didn't even really think about it at first. And I was like, wait, I've done this before. I've sat in those seats. This is fun. So some of the key actors involved in the attempts to compromise, I kind of touched on this a little bit, but we saw like the personal letters where they reached out on their own time, which goes back to some of the things that Tori and Sarah already said with like the Kingdon's process and with the agenda and the alternative. So we saw like the governor had his own agenda and like the task force, and then the Republican senators kind of came back and said, like, this is the thing that we see important. How can we change it? So the senators had a different idea of what they wanted, like early versus middle-aged childhood education and care that was important. So there was a little bit of like maybe a political agenda, but I think it was just who we saw as the most important age to target, or who the different groups saw as the most important ages to target. Task force members included Secretary for Cabinet of Family and Children, which I just didn't even know existed. Not a position I was familiar with. And then they negotiated and changed the bill based on what others wanted from the party. And they did take into consideration, the task force members took into consideration what the senators wanted, and they kind of adjusted their bill a little bit. So there was a really good compromise, I thought, that was evidence in the video. To what degree do you think the Senate Republicans challenged purely for political reasons? The governor kind of claimed that. I don't know if it was like maybe a little bit emotionally driven, which I think we see probably a lot in politics. But I do think that maybe they just purely had different ideas in mind of who they wanted to target and who needed the most care. I could see a little bit of like true based discussion happening. But I'm not totally sure as to what I think on that question.
A little bit that I noticed from that is that they proposed their own bill for that.
Yeah.
So they were definitely trying to fight it completely. So
Yeah. I just don't know if I know what their motive was, I guess.
I don't either. I don't know
No.
if it's just, the Democrat, Republican,
Yeah.
not agreeing and don't want somebody, and where it was the governor seemed to hold that bill pretty close to his heart. Maybe
Mhm.
they weren't on the same page with him and wanted to put every stop they possibly could. But that definitely shows how this process is super complicated and can allow all opinions from everyone to come in.
And it might have been too just because they had the majority and the Democrats didn't. So I think maybe that was just, like there's a little bit more pushback rather than just automatically passing something that's from your same party. I think that could have played a little bit of a factor into it.
Yeah, like Tori was saying about like how it's so complicated. Like I feel like it's so difficult to delineate what the motivation is, as far as if it's like, is it the individual? Is it their constituency? Is it their political party? Like, are they trying to align their decision with which one of these motivators? So I feel like it's so multifaceted and complex for every decision.
Yeah, for sure. And they did mention too, like the governor was so passionate about it because it was a large majority of the reason why a large majority of his like campaign.
Yeah.
He ran based off of that. So I think that maybe played a role.
Thing that was pointed out in that video was they said in order to get a bill passed, the founding fathers made it complicated. I mean, complexity creates lots of opportunities for input and keeps the process from being dominated by, the Republican Party or the Democrat Party. So I didn't realize how complicated it actually was to get a bill passed until looking through all of this stuff.
Yeah, even when I was like 14, it was complicated. So I can only imagine when it's real money and like real opinions and power. It all goes back to checks and balances, like that we heard in the video. And then what other issues may have concerned them? And we kind of already talked about these, but obviously the research, both groups had research that showed what stage in a child's life was most important to intervene. And then money obviously is always going to be a factor for anything. And then the influence on the population, like where is it most important to target children early on or later in adolescent years. So I just wanted to touch a little bit on what a lobbyist is. So a lobbyist basically has a team essentially that they work for, and they can advocate strongly for one side of a bill, and they help to get that bill passed. So they do a lot of like the go-between and like the behind the scenes work to see or to, I guess, not push the other side to sway their vote, but motivate them strongly. And there's lobbyists like all throughout state and federal government work. So you'll see them quite a bit.
And here are our references. Please let us know if you have any questions or comments. And we hope you learned something.
Okay.